Hello, and welcome to Conquering Finale. My name is Morpheus, and this is the measure number matrix. Today we're looking at measure number visibility, or in other words, exactly where the measure numbers are showing on your score, both vertically and horizontally. So let's get talking about this right away. And initially, you can see this is basically set up how the default document in Finale would be set up. And the way that Finale is doing this for me right now is that I've got a measure number at the start of the system on top of the soprano part and on top of the piano part here. And it starts on the second system, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's go back into that measure number region dialog box. And we've already talked about everything in the top portion of this. Now we're talking about everything in the bottom portion of this. And this is where the magic happens for where these measure numbers become visible. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, I think there's different options for the score and the linked parts. And there's two tabs for this. And by default, with the default document, Finale will choose this option here for use score settings for the linked parts. However, if you uncheck this, then all of these options become available to you, and you can make the positionings and fonts and everything, including enclosures, all these options are now independent from the score. So you can have two completely different setups between the score and the linked parts. As you can see within the score, that option doesn't exist because it's relative to the linked parts. It's just saying use the score settings or don't. More often than not, you want to have your linked parts to have a different setup for your bar numbers. So I recommend unchecking this and making your settings here, but also differently for your score, just like this. Now, one thing that I should mention is I talked about in the first video, when you start dealing with multiple regions, like if you're doing skipped measures, A and B measures and all that stuff, sometimes you'll end up with 5, 6, 7, 8 different regions. Now, every single region can have its own set of positions. Everything in this bottom section can be set individually per region, which means that if you do have a file that has a lot of that stuff in it, I recommend setting it up, doing one region first like this. So you have 1 through, 9999, and setting your position here, and then adding, and then, changing the definition to do the A and B bars and everything. The reason for that is that, once you press the add button, you're duplicating these settings for the positionings exactly from this region to the new region. So if you hadn't set these up ahead of time, you now have 7 copies of the wrong version of the positioning, and you'd have to go through individually, region by region, and reset all of these settings 7 different times. So if you catch my drift, make these settings first to the first region before you start adding regions and doing your A and B bars and all that stuff. That'll just save you a big headache. So let's start talking about what some of these options are. Now, again, you have separate options for the linked part and the score, but every single option here works exactly the same, whether or not you're viewing the linked part tab here or viewing the score tab here. So for now, I'll mostly be dealing with the score tab. As I said, all of these they work exactly the same. Now, below here, we have sort of 4 different sections that we're dealing with. The first is the show on section. There's only 3 options here. This is dealing with where the measure numbers get placed vertically in the score. In other words, which staff gets the measure numbers. In this case, you see that the soprano staff and the top of the piano staff get the measure number. The tricky thing to this is that these options have a lot of interplay with an option that exists in the staff attributes for each staff. Now, in the staff attributes, under the items to display, there's an option here for measure numbers at the bottom of the first column, and it says measure numbers, and it's checked for the soprano part. It is unchecked for the alto part, tenor part, etc., except all the way down until the first staff of the piano part, where it's checked, and the second staff for the piano part is unchecked, right? There's a key sort of interplay between this option and that option that exists in the measure number region dialog box here. And I'll tell you exactly how this works. With the top staff option checked, this will put the measure number on the top staff regardless of whether or not the top staff happens to have that measure number item to display in the staff attributes or not, if that makes sense. With it unchecked, then only the staffs that have that option checked in the staff attributes will show the measure number. Now, this is not going to change because it happens that the soprano staff does have this option checked for measure numbers. And of course, we can go and change this and add this anywhere we want. If we want to add it to the clarinet part, we can do that, and you'll see the measure number appear on the clarinet part as well. However, if the soprano staff was not showing that and you chose top staff, it will put it on the top staff regardless. And actually, if the top staff changes, if you're hiding empty measures or something, using this top staff option will ensure that the measure number will always be on the top staff, no matter which staff is on the top of the score at any given point, if that makes sense. We can do the same with the bottom staff, and choosing this option will force it to show on the bottom staff, again, no matter what the setting is for the bottom staff and the staff attributes, and again, no matter what staff is actually on the bottom of the score. With either or both of these checked, we have the option, you see it's grayed out now, but with one of them checked, you have the option to exclude other staffs. With this option checked, you're overriding all of the settings in the staff attributes for all of the other staffs in the score. So now I've got this checked, even though the piano part, the right hand, had that measure number items to display checked in the staff attributes, it's not showing here because this option to exclude other staffs is overriding that. All right, so again, it's sort of an important to understand how these two things interact, the show on options here and the staff attributes. There's a lot of flexibility here if you know kind of how this works. The next two sections, the show on start of staff system and show on every, and there's a number here, measures beginning with measures such and such. And these you can change these numbers, and I'll show you that in a second. These two sections here, show on start and show on every, refer to horizontal position or horizontal visibility, I suppose, of the measure numbers. In other words, which measures actually get measure numbers. And there's sort of, as you can see, there's two options here. And out of the box, Finale sets us up to show on start of staff system, but the show on every is unchecked. And what this does, as you suspect, is that it will put the measure numbers only on the start of the staff system. I'll get to the enclosures in a second, but right below that, there's an option to hide first measure number in region. Now, in this particular region, including measures 1 through 999, starting number 1, the first measure number is measure 1. So with this checked, that's why you see a measure number here at 5, but you don't see here 1 at the beginning of the piece on measure 1. If I uncheck that, it will now show that measure number 1 at the beginning of the piece. So a little bit of flexibility there. Now, as you can see, this is only showing at the start of the staff system, and it doesn't matter which measure is actually at the start of the staff system. So if I were to move measure 4 down here, now it's going to show measure 4. If I were to move measure 4 up, now it's showing measure 5. So again, it's only showing whichever bar happens to be at the beginning of the system. With the show on every option, if I check this, now I'm showing on every one measure beginning with measure 1, it will do just that. Now it will show the measure numbers on every single measure horizontally for that entire region. So one, in that case, it's 1 through 9999. It'll keep showing measure numbers on every bar all the way up through bar 9999. All right. Now, you may be wondering, well, don't they overlap? Because showing on every one measure would also show on measure 1, also show on measure 5, etc., even though those numbers happen to be at the start of the staff system. And that is absolutely true. And the other thing about this is that the font and the positions, which I'm going to talk about in a second, can be different between the show on start number and the show on every number, right? So, and particularly the position in this case is going to be different for the show on every versus the show on start of staff. When both of these options, this is what I'm trying to say in the long-winded way. When both of these options are checked, the show on start of staff system will override the show on every if the for the beginning of the system. Now, if I uncheck show on start of staff system but leave this one checked, it will still show on measure 1, on measure 5, etc. But you'll see that it actually puts it in a slightly different position where it puts it after the time signature here instead of at the beginning of the system. This is because that show on every positioning the position for this is actually relative to sort of the bar line and the beginning of the music for every frame, essentially. And when I select a measure, you'll see what I mean. There's a blue sort of selection here, and you can see the measure number is just on the left edge of that. If I select measure 1, you'll see that blue frame ends right after the time signature. It doesn't get extended to the beginning of the system. That's why that measure number in this case is being put here. Now again, with the show on start of staff system, it's overriding this on the first measure and the fifth measure and every measure that starts the system to put it in a position that's relative to the left bar line of the entire system, which is why now it gets jumped over here. It's actually not possible to show it in both places, not that you would. I guess that's a good thing the way Finale does this, but so that's exactly what's going on. It is possible to uncheck this and get a different position for that measure at the beginning of the staff system. So let's talk a little bit more about the design options available in both of these sections for the show on start and show on every. And actually with the enclosures, the set font and the positions, these all work exactly the same, except they're completely independent for this particular scenario. So we can have an enclosure on the show on start, but not on the show on every, and that would literally do that. You'd get an enclosure here, but not here. Or vice versa. Same with font. You can set the font for the show on start differently than the show on every. I wouldn't recommend that. You'd probably want to try and keep your fonts the same between these two options, unless you're doing it for a certain effect. But it's available to do it differently if you want. Now, as far as the enclosure is concerned, you have all these options to choose from. And if you press Edit, we get the Enclosure Designer, which I'm not going to talk about right now because I did a really in-depth video on this in the Expression Tool category. I believe it was 15-4B. I'll put a link to that in the video. And it will tell you exactly how to use this Enclosure Designer, and it works exactly the same for the measure numbers as it does for the expressions. So you can check out that video to learn more about how this works. But suffice it to say, if you check that option, you can get enclosures on your measure numbers. In fact, if I check them in both places here, you'll see the enclosures on all of the measure numbers. For now, let's just uncheck that. And let's talk about the font. Now, this is sort of a typical window you'll see in Finale a lot. You get to choose the font from the left side, the type of typeface, the size, the style, etc. You can set this however you want, and that's pretty easy to use. What I should mention is that there actually is in the document options under fonts, under notation, under text, there is an option for measure number text font. And this is set to Times New Roman 10 italics, and you can set this however you want. This is the default font for the measure numbers. However, the only time that would ever be relevant is if there was no region in here. Because as I mentioned in the first video, when you press Add, it is duplicating the region that you have selected. In fact, if you don't have a region selected and you press Add, it will duplicate this first region here. The only way that Finale will ever reference that default font from the document options is if you were to delete this and add a new one. So if I'm not going to do it right now, but if I delete this box becomes empty. I press Add, and it will generate the font based on that setting in the document options. So really almost no reason to ever change that, because once you have it set here, that's exactly how it's going to flow down from region to region, because again, the add is just duplicating. So then let's start talking about position. And again, there's different options for the show on start and show on every, and they're completely independent, so you can have different positions. And in fact, in this particular setup, they are independent, and I'll show you exactly why in a second. Now, when you press the position button, you'll get the position measure number dialog box up here, and there's a few options, and we have alignment options, justification options. Now, we can align left, and that's essentially aligning to the left bar line. Now, again, the difference between doing this with the show on start and show on every position is that in the show on start, the left bar line is actually this left bar line all the way at the end of the system on the left side. With the show on every, this left bar line is the left bar line if it's a measure in the middle of the system, but it's that position here at the left edge of this blue box otherwise. So in other words, it's not the left bar line at the start of the system if you're adjusting the show on every position, if that makes sense. So we have alignment options left, right, and center. Now, I have never, ever, ever, ever used the right alignment for a measure number. I think that would be utterly confusing because you would think that this measure number applies to the next measure coming up. I have used center quite often, and of course I've used the left alignment as well. But the right alignment is there if you want. And you can see as I'm doing this, the justification by default will change to that as well. So if I align center, the justification will initially go to center. If I align left, it will go to left. But we can make this independent, so you can, align left but center justify. This would essentially let the measure number be centered over the bar line if you want, and it's actually set like that in the show on every, which I'll show you in a second. Or you can left align, left justify. And then the distance from the staff, there's a horizontal and vertical offsets that you can add and subtract. So if you put a 0.1 value here, it will send the measure number a little bit farther to the right from that left bar line position. Same thing with, incidentally, this horizontal 0 point will be different depending on the alignment. So if it's set to align left, the 0 point is the left bar line there. If it's right, then the 0 point is the right bar line, and if it's center, then the 0 point is exactly center of the measure. And you can go, positive or negative in either direction to adjust it from there. The vertical is exactly that. It's referencing the top staff line, so a value of 0.15 is putting it 0.15 inches above the top staff line. If I were to set this to 0, you can see that it will sit right on top of that bar line. I believe negative 0.35 will put it pretty much in line with the bottom staff line. Something along the lines of negative 0.5 will give you a position that will go below the staff there. But let's set this back to normal, 0.15, and so that's how that works. The other thing is obviously you can, well, maybe not obviously, but you can actually grab the measure number and move it around to position it more precisely if you want to do it that way. I tend to like to use the number so I can be more consistent and more precise, but you can grab that measure number if you want. And click OK. So now I've set the position for the show on start of staff system. And again, the position for the show on every will be independent of that. And you can see that the show on every, again, this is a default document. The way the Finale sets this up is slightly different. This is left aligned, so it's aligning to the left bar line, center justified. So this measure number is going to be centered on the bar line. And the vertical offset's a little bit lower at 0.09. And you can kind of see the result of that. If you look carefully, you can see the 2 is just a little bit lower relative to the number at the start of the staff system here. So just a couple other things to talk about in these options. I talked about the hide and first measure, number, and region. This will incidentally only apply to the show on start of staff system. So I tried this before. You can't actually, if you're showing on every one, hide first measure, this doesn't actually work. It won't hide the first measure there. It only really applies to the show on start of staff system setting here. There's an option here for break multi-measure rest. Now, this really could only be handy if you were to change the values here. Now, again, what I've been talking about is primarily to show on every one measure, beginning with measure 1, but these values can be changed. So, for example, if I wanted to show every 8 measures, starting with measure 9, effectively what I can do, and actually what I should probably do is uncheck show on start of staff system as well. What I can effectively do is only show a measure number every 8 bars, starting with measure 9. You can see there's a measure 9 here, and then I don't have enough measures to keep going, but if I had one more measure, it would show a measure 17. Now, with that, with that break multi-measure rest option checked, what this could do is, let's see if I go to a part. Of course, see, you have to make sure that the linked parts in the score settings are different. So now I have to go and set this to show on every 8, starting with 9. break multi-measure rest, and you'll see the bar number 9 here and nowhere else. And now if I were to select this whole thing and try and create a multi-measure rest, you'll see that it will break that multi-measure rest at the bar number, which can be handy, I guess, if you want to do something like this. You know, the thing is, like, if you have show on every one measure and you choose break a multi-measure rest, you would never ever be able to create a multi-measure rest, just because it's literally breaking the multi-measure rest every single bar. You can't create one. This option has some limited uses. Certainly, if you're using bars on every measure, there's no point in using that option. Let me just go back. Actually, I'm going to stay in the part for a second. Go back here. So let's talk about the last section here, show on multi-measure rest, or show measure ranges on multi-measure rest. So let's see, if I set this up differently, again, I'm in the linked parts. Incidentally, if you enter the measure number region dialog box from a linked part, and if the linked part is set separately from the score, it will automatically open this tab. This is really handy because you could mistakenly start making changes to the score setting when you're actually looking at the linked part. Finale is assuming that if you open it from the linked part, you want to make changes to the linked part, so that's kind of handy. So let's set this up a little bit differently. Let's just do this. Let's show on start of staff system and not show on every one measure. So we should get measure numbers. Yep, 1, 5, 9, and 13. And I'm actually going to go back to my soprano part because I have this set up slightly differently. And I'm going to choose this option to show on multi-measure rests. And what this will do, it will show a measure number on the multi-measure rest only. I'm still showing at the start of the staff system, so it's actually only going to add one here. There already is a measure number showing at the start of the staff system here, so there's no reason to add another measure number to the beginning of the multi-measure rest in bar 9 in this particular case. Now the thing is, if I am showing on every one measure, and I do have that unchecked, the measure number will appear on the multi-measure rest anyway. So this option really is only useful if you want to show that measure number on the measure number rest, but you're not otherwise showing that measure number on the measure. Otherwise, it's redundant. It doesn't matter if you have that checked or unchecked. Nothing's going to be different about it. All right. The more sort of useful piece of this last section is the show measure ranges on multi-measure rest. Now this is what's going to allow you in these multi-measure rests to show measures 5 through 8 in this case in a certain way, and you have the option to choose a left and right bracket. I always like to use the square brackets for these, so just enter a left square bracket, a right square bracket. And you can set your font. Again, this font and positions work pretty much the same way as the other ones. You set the font the way that you want to. You can set the position. Now, normally the position for these types of ranges will be exactly right here, alignment center, justification center, below the staff. So I'm not going to change this for now. And when you have this option checked, I've got the brackets there. You'll see that now I can show the measure number ranges on the multi-measure rest. And obviously this will only show the measure number ranges if there's a multi-measure rest. If I break it, obviously you won't see that. And also what happens is that when you do show the ranges, it will stop showing the regular number on the beginning of the bar here, which I think is really handy. I think I've always thought it was redundant when you show something like that, where you're showing the measure range plus the measure number. So handily, Finale will actually suppress the measure number from appearing when the measure number ranges is appearing in the multi-measure rest, if that makes sense. Interestingly, it's actually a little bit tricky to get them appear in both places. If you wanted the 5 here and the 5 through 8 here, it's actually kind of tricky to do that. You'd have to sort of create another region that only had measure 5 that did not have this option checked. And it was showing, on every one measure, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of an odd workaround to actually show both of those things. But for my money, I actually think this is a better solution anyway. And I would never want to see that measure number there as well. And I'm just looking through my notes right now. There's a lot to this, so I just wanted to make sure that I covered everything. again, this measure number region dialog box is so confusing, but there's so much flexibility here. So, I know it took a lot of time, but I think once you sort of get a grasp of this, you're really going to sort of master this measure number matrix going on here. So, I hope this has helped. I know it's a lot, but hopefully this has been helpful. So the next video I'm going to do is going to be more about, showing and hiding and manually positioning measure numbers, which, itself gets way deeper down the rabbit hole, as it were. So, looking forward to that. Probably going to be another long video, but, like I said, these measure numbers are very complicated. So, it's got to be done. All right. So once again, thanks for watching, and I will see you soon on the next measure number matrix video.